The crash was deafening. One moment, my old oak tree stood tall and proud, shading my yard with its wide branches, and the next was sprawled across the shiny red convertible parked in the Karen sisters' driveway. The windshield shattered like ice, the roof caved in, and their screams pierced the air. My heart raced, not from guilt, but from shock and maybe, if I was honest, a little satisfaction. After all, this wasn't an accident. They had brought it on themselves. For weeks, the sisters had been nagging me to cut down my tree, claiming it blocked their view and dropped leaves near their fence. I refused, because the tree was perfectly healthy, older than both of them combined, and on my property. But entitled people don't take no lightly, and their arrogance led them to make the worst decision of their lives. The morning started like any other. The sun had just begun to rise, its light spilling through the branches of the massive oak tree in my front yard. That tree was more than just a piece of nature to MIT, was history. It had been there long before I bought the house, long before the neighborhood even developed into rows of cookie-cutter homes and overly trimmed lawns. Its roots ran deep, its branches stretched wide, and its shade gave me comfort every summer. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch with a cold drink, watching the breeze move through its leaves, feeling like it was keeping me company. But not everyone saw the tree that way. For some, like the Karen sisters next door, it was nothing more than an ugly obstacle. They had moved in a year earlier, dragging with them their loud opinions, high-pitched voices, and a sense of entitlement that could choke the air. From the moment they unpacked their boxers, they made it clear they thought they owned not just their property, but the entire street. I had learned to tune out most of their antics, complaints about neighbors parking too close to their driveway, the way they tried to boss around the mailman for delivering their packages too late, and even the time they yelled at kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk. But the one thing I couldn't ignore was their obsession with my oak tree. First confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. I was mowing the lawn when the older sister, Patricia though everyone just called her Petite, marched up in her bright pink slippers, holding a mug of coffee like a weapon. She pointed straight at my tree as if it had personally insulted her. "Thing," she said, wrinkling her nose. "It blocks our view. Every time I look out my kitchen window, all I see is branches. You need to cut it down." I stopped the mower and stared at her. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she said, sipping her coffee loudly. "It's ugly. It drops leaves all over our yard, and it makes our house look dark. Nobody wants to live in a gloomy neighborhood." Before I could even answer, her younger sister Denise popped her head over the fence. Denise was always echoing Patty, like some kind of backup singer in an annoying band. "She's right," Denise chimed in. "We moved here for the view, and that tree ruins it. You should have gotten rid of it a long time ago." I laughed, though not because it was funny. The tree is on my property. It's perfectly healthy, and I have no reason to cut it down. If the leaves bother you, rake them. That's what rakes are for. Patty's jaw dropped like I had slapped her. "Excuse me, are you saying no?" "Yes," I said flatly. "No." Her face turned red, and Denise gasped dramatically like she was in a soap opera. Patty wagged her finger at me. "You'll regret this. That tree is an eyesore and it's not staying." With that, she stomped back to her porch, muttering under her breath. Denise followed, glaring at me as if I had just committed a crime. I shook my head, restarted the mower, and went back to my business. But I knew it wouldn't end there. People like them never let things go. Over the next few weeks, the sisters made it their mission to harass me about the oak. Every time I walked outside, one of them would yell across the fence, "Still haven't called a tree service? Don't you care about property values? Do you enjoy making the neighborhood look bad?" I ignored them at first, but it wore on me. One evening as I watered my garden, Denise leaned over the fence again. "We looked it up. Cutting down a tree isn't that expensive. If you can't afford it, maybe we'll pitch in." I set the hose down and glared at her. "I don't need your money, and I don't need your opinion. The tree stays. End of discussion." She flinched at my tone, then narrowed her eyes. "You're selfish. Completely selfish." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the arguments in my head. I wasn't going to be bullied into giving up something that mattered to me, especially not by two women who thought the world owed them everything. But still, I couldn't shake the unease in my gut. The way they spoke, the way they threatened. Without really threatening, I knew they were planning something. My suspicion was confirmed one morning when I found a note taped to my door, written in bold, angry handwriting. It read, "Cut down the tree, or we'll handle it ourselves." I stood there on my porch holding the note, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. They couldn't be serious, could they? I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash, refusing to let them get into my head. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. The Karen sisters weren't the type to bluff, and as much as I loved that oak tree, I couldn't shake the uneasy thought creeping into my mind that something bad was about to happen. The note should have been the last straw. Most people, if they received a threat like that from their neighbors, would have gone straight to the police or at least called a lawyer. But I didn't. Maybe I was too stubborn, or maybe I just didn't believe the sisters were actually capable of doing anything. To me, they were all noise and no bite, just entitled busybodies who liked to bark when they didn't get their way. Still, That piece of paper burned in the back of my mind. I found myself looking out the window more often, checking the yard, and keeping an eye on the oak tree like it was a child I needed to protect. At night, I'd step onto the porch just to listen. The neighborhood was quiet, the crickets singing in the grass, but in the silence, I half expected to hear the hum of a chainsaw. Days went by with nothing more than their usual comments. Patty would shoot me dirty looks every time she pulled her car out of the driveway, and Denise would toss her head dramatically whenever I passed her on the sidewalk. One afternoon, I overheard them talking loudly enough for the entire block to hear. "I don't care what he says," Patty snapped to her sister. "That tree is coming down. He's so selfish, acting like it belongs to him and him alone. It's ruining the whole street," Denise agreed. "Nobody wants to live next to some gloomy old tree. It's dangerous too. What if it falls? It could crush our house." I stood behind my fence watering the lawn, pretending not to listen, but my grip tightened on the hose. Dangerous? That tree had stood through storms, wind, and years of weather without so much as losing a major branch. It wasn't dangerous, it was strong. And if anyone was dangerous, it was them. The real trouble began a few weeks later when I came home from work to find a flyer pinned to my front door. At first I thought it was some local advertisement, maybe for a pizza place or lawn service, but no. This one was different. It was a printed sheet with bold letters at the top: "Tree removal services affordable, fast, reliable." At the bottom of the page someone had circled the phone number in red ink, and scribbled underneath, in handwriting I recognized all too well, were the words, "Call them or else." I felt my blood boil. They weren't just bothering me now, they were trying to push me into paying for their demands. I crumpled the flyer and stormed into the house. For the rest of the evening, I paced, replaying all their smug faces and arrogant words. Part of me wanted to march right over, slam the flyer down on their doorstep and let them have it. But another part of me thought better of it. That's what they wanted, a fighter reaction. Instead, I decided to document everything. I started saving the notes, the flyers, even recording some of the louder arguments they staged on their porch. I figured if things escalated, at least I'd have proof. And escalate, they did. The next weekend I caught them in my yard. It was early, just after sunrise. When I heard rustling near the fence, I peeked through the blinds and froze. There they were, the two sisters, standing under the oak tree with measuring tape and a clipboard like they were planning some kind of demolition. Rushed outside, my voice sharp. "What are you doing?" Patty didn't even flinch. She scribbled something on the clipboard and looked up at me calmly like she was the one in charge. "We're documenting the problem. This tree leans too far toward our property. It's a hazard, and if you won't do something about it, we will. You're trespassing," I shouted. Denise rolled her eyes. "We're just protecting our property. If that tree falls, it'll crush our garage. You'll be the one paying for it." I marched over, my fists clenched. "Get off my yard now, and if I ever see you near this tree again, I'll call the police." For a moment, I thought they'd back down, but Patty only smirked, handed the clipboard to her sister, and whispered something in her ear. They walked off slowly, as if daring me to stop them, their shoulders stiff with defiance. That evening my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, a man's voice asked, "Hello, are you the homeowner with the oak tree on Maple Street? We've received a request for removal." I nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me, who requested that?" "The neighbors, ma'am. They said you wanted it scheduled as soon as possible." My anger bubbled over. "Absolutely not. Do not come here. That tree is mine, and I never asked for removal." The man sounded confused, but apologized quickly, promising to cancel the request. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. They had actually gone as far as calling a tree service in my name. This wasn't just petty anymore, it was deliberate sabotage. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind brushing the leaves outside made me sit up in bed. I had always thought of the oak as unshakable, a symbol of permanence, but now it felt vulnerable, like it was a target waiting to be struck. The following days I noticed subtle changes. The sisters stopped yelling at me directly, but they whispered constantly, their eyes flicking toward my yard whenever I stepped outside. They had grown quieter, and that, somehow, was worse. Silence meant plotting. Silence meant they were up to something. One afternoon, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw them standing by their shiny red convertible, pointing at the tree and laughing. When they noticed me, their smiles vanished, replaced with icy stares. Patty mouthed something across the street, words I couldn't quite catch, but her smirk told me everything I needed to know. The game had shifted. They weren't going to stop at threats, or flyers, or fake service calls. No, the Karen sisters had made up their minds. My tree was going to come down whether I liked it or not, and though I didn't realize it then, the disaster waiting to unfold would be far bigger than anything they could have imagined. The morning it all happened began unusually quiet. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that makes you suspicious. I woke up earlier than usual, around 6, with sunlight creeping through the blinds. Something about the stillness, unsettled me. Normally I'd hear birds chattering in the oak tree, or the faint sound of traffic starting up down the road. But that morning, there was nothing, just silence. I slipped on my shoes and stepped onto the porch. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The yard was still shaded by the oak. The street was calm, and the neighbors' houses were dark. But then I heard it, a low, steady buzzing in the distance. The kind of sound that only comes from one thing. A chainsaw. My stomach dropped. The noise grew louder, and within seconds I realized it wasn't coming from down the street. It was coming from my own yard. I bolted off the porch, heart hammering, and rounded the corner. And there they were, the Karen sisters, each wearing gardening gloves, safety goggles that looked too big for their faces, and smug expressions. As they hacked away at the base of my tree, Patty held the chainsaw, struggling to control the weight of it as it chewed into the bark. Denise stood beside her, gripping the trunk like she was helping to guide the cut. Sawdust sprayed around them, sticking to their hair and clothes. "Are you out of your minds?" I shouted, running toward them. They both froze, then looked at me like I was the one trespassing. Patty smirked, sweat dripping down her temple. "We warned you. We told you it had to come down. So we're doing what you refused to. You can't just..." My voice cracked with rage. "That tree is on my property. You're trespassing. Put that chainsaw down before someone gets hurt." Denise rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh please, you should be thanking us. We're saving your yard from this ugly, dangerous mess." The buzzing roared again as Patty pressed the chainsaw deeper into the trunk. My chest tightened as I realized how far they'd already gone. The cut wasn't deep yet, but it was enough to make the tree groan, its great body shifting ever so slightly. I rushed forward, but Denise jumped in front of me, holding her arms out wide. "Don't even think about it," she snapped. "This is for the good of the neighborhood." My fists clenched. Part of me wanted to shove past her, wrestle the chainsaw out of Patty's hands, and call the cops on the spot. But before I could act, it happened. The oak tree shuddered. A long, low crack echoed through the yard, so loud it seemed to split the air. Patty yelped, dropping the chainsaw as the trunk split wider. The branches above rattled violently, and in that slow, surreal moment, I knew what was coming. "Move!" I screamed, but they didn't move fast enough. The tree tilted, leaning heavily toward their side of the fence. The sound was deafening, the creak of wood, the groan of roots tearing from the earth, the snap of branches breaking free. For a brief second, I thought it might fall toward my house. My heart lurched into my throat. But no. Gravity had other plans. With a thunderous crash, the oak tree toppled directly onto their bright red convertible, parked neatly in their driveway. The impact was catastrophic. The windshield shattered instantly, glass spraying across the pavement. The roof crumpled inward like a crushed soda can. The hood buckled under the weight of the trunk, alarm blaring in a shrill, desperate wail before dying out. The silence that followed was almost worse than the crash. Patty and Denise stood frozen, their mouths open in horror, their eyes wide as they stared at the wreckage. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the faint creak of the branches settling against the metal, the oak now lying lifeless across what had once been their pride and joy. Then came the screaming. "My car!" Patty shrieked, her voice shrill enough to pierce the air. She stumbled forward, clutching her head like she'd just watched someone die. "My beautiful car." Denise joined in, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is your fault. You did this. You set us up." I stared at them in disbelief, my blood boiling. "Are you kidding me? I told you to stop. I told you this would happen if you touched that tree." Patty turned on me, her face twisted with rage. "You planned this. You knew it would fall this way." I laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah, because I can control physics now. You cut into the trunk. You made this happen." Before they could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. I hadn't even noticed one of the neighbors standing across the street, phone in hand, watching the whole thing unfold. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. The officers stepped out, their eyes widening at the sight of the massive tree crushing the convertible. One of them let out a low whistle. "What the hell happened here?" Patty wasted no time. She rushed toward them, waving her arms. Officer, arrest him. He destroyed our car. He tricked us into cutting his tree so it would fall on our property." The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, slow down." "Who had the chainsaw?" Patty hesitated, glancing at Denise. Denise swallowed hard, but neither of them answered. I crossed my arms, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "They trespassed onto my property and tried to cut down my tree without permission. The chainsaw they used is right there." I pointed to the ground, where the tool still lay buzzing faintly before sputtering out. The second officer walked over, inspecting the half-finished cut at the base of the trunk. He turned to his partner, nodding. "Looks pretty clear to me." Patty's face went pale. Denise stammered, but it's his fault. He refused to listen. He made us do it." The first officer shook his head. "Ma'am, nobody made you pick up a chainsaw. You're both responsible for this damage. And from the looks of it, you've caused destruction of property and trespassed." Patty shrieked again, her voice breaking. "Do you know how much that car was worth?" The officer raised an eyebrow. Do you know how much a lawyer's going to cost you after this? I couldn't help it. A small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. For weeks they had harassed me, threatened me, and ignored every warning. And now, standing there with their crushed car beneath the wreckage of the very tree they hated, justice had finally caught up with them. They wanted the oak gone. Well, they got their wish. But it had taken their precious convertible with it, and somehow, that felt like the most perfect kind of karma. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the street, drawing more and more neighbors from their homes. Within minutes, the quiet Saturday morning had turned into a full-blown spectacle. People gathered on the sidewalks, whispering and pointing at the wreckage in the Karen's driveway. The sight was impossible to ignore. A massive oak sprawled across a once shiny convertible, its branches poking out at odd angles like twisted arms, the car underneath flattened beyond recognition. I stood near my porch, arms crossed, doing my best to keep calm as the officers questioned Patty and Denise. The sisters had gone from furious to frantic. Patty paced the driveway, her hands flailing as she tried to convince the officers that I was somehow responsible. Denise sobbed loudly, the kind of dramatic crying that sounded rehearsed, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. The officers, however, weren't buying it. One of them jotted notes in a small pad while the other kept shaking his head. Every time Patty pointed at me, the officer would glance over, then look back at the chainsaw lying at the base of the tree. Evidence didn't lie, ma'am, the taller officer finally said, his tone sharp. You admitted you started cutting this tree down. That makes you responsible for the damages. You can't trespass on someone else's property, destroy their belongings, and then blame them for the outcome. Patty's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But he provoked us. That's not how the law works, the officer replied coolly. The neighbors murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, others outright laughing. I caught a few snickers from across the street. It was no secret that the Karen sisters had rubbed everyone the wrong way since moving in. Their constant complaints, their entitled demands, it had all built up to this moment, and now the whole block was watching karma crush them harder than the tree crushed their car. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, because finally someone else was seeing the madness I'd been living with. Anger, because they had risked everything just to get their way. And, if I was honest, satisfaction. They wanted that tree gone so badly. They took matters into their own hands, and now they were facing the consequences in front of an entire audience. Sir, the officer called to me, breaking my thoughts. Can you confirm the tree was on your property? Yes, I said firmly. The trunk is several feet inside my boundary. I have records from when I bought the house, if you need proof. He nodded. And did you give them permission to cut it? Absolutely not. In fact, I told them several times to stay away from it. The officer scribbled in his notebook. All right, we'll need you to provide a statement later, but based on what I see here, you're not liable. This is on them. Patty let out a shriek so loud the crowd flinched. This isn't fair. He's lying. He tricked us into this. Her words fell flat. Even Denise, who had been crying non-stop, glanced at her sister with wide, panicked eyes. She knew it was over. The officers didn't waste time. They explained to the sisters that charges for trespassing and destruction of property would be filed, and that they'd also be held responsible for the costs of removing the fallen tree. On top of that, the ruined car was their own loss insurance. Wasn't going to cover damage they'd caused themselves. Patty tried to argue, but the officers silenced her with a glare. You've already admitted to cutting the tree, one of them said. That's enough. The sisters collapsed onto their porch steps, defeated. Denise buried her face in her hands while Patty stared blankly at the crushed convertible as though she still couldn't believe what had happened. The crowd slowly began to disperse, neighbors whispering as they headed back to their homes. A few shot me sympathetic looks, some even giving small nods as if to say, good for you. About time someone put them in their place. I stood there for a long while after the officers left, staring at the wreckage. The oak tree had been part of my life for years, and now it was gone, reduced to a pile of branches and shattered wood. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by something stronger. Justice. The sisters had finally reaped what they had sown. The following week was chaos for them. A professional removal crew arrived to take apart the fallen tree, and, since the sisters were liable, they had to foot the bill. Watching the workers haul away the remains piece by piece was bittersweet. I mourned the loss of my oak, but I couldn't ignore the poetic justice of it all. The sisters paid thousands of dollars to clean up the very mess they created. Word spread quickly. The story became neighborhood gossip, then trickled into the larger town. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some called it karma, others poetic justice, and a few even joked that the tree had a mind of its own, choosing its final resting place perfectly. The sisters, however, didn't take it well. Their convertible was gone, their reputations in ruins, and they walked around the block with their heads down, no longer barking at the mailman or yelling at kids on bikes. The once loud Karens had been silenced by their own arrogance. One evening, as I watered my now empty yard, Patty dared to approach me. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't look smug. "You're going to regret this," she muttered. I set down the hose, staring at her. "I regret nothing. You destroyed your own car, and you destroyed my tree. You should be the one regretting it." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned on her heel and disappeared back into her house. I knew then that the war between us was over, not because they had surrendered willingly, but because they had lost so spectacularly that they had no fight left. Life slowly returned to normal, though the stump of the oak in my yard stood as a daily reminder of the chaos. Neighbors would stop by occasionally, shaking their heads and telling me how unbelievable the whole thing had been. Some even thanked me, saying the sisters had needed to be put in their place. But the truth was, I hadn't done anything. Karma had done all the work. The Karens had picked up the chainsaw, ignored the warnings, and brought the disaster down on themselves. And though the oak tree was gone, its final act lived on in memory. It had fallen with perfect timing, crushing the symbol of their pride, teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. Weeks passed, and the once chaotic scene in front of the Karen sisters' house became nothing more than a memory etched into the neighborhood's history. The giant oak was gone, the stump sitting in my yard like a quiet monument to everything that had unfolded. Grass was starting to grow around it, and birds that once nested in its branches now searched for other trees nearby. The sight always gave me a pang of sadness, but there was something almost noble in the way it had ended, like the tree had chosen to make a final stand, teaching a lesson nobody on our street would ever forget. The Karen sisters had changed too, though not in the way you might expect. Patty and Denise didn't suddenly become humble or apologetic. No, their pride wouldn't allow that. Instead, they grew quiet. Their once loud voices that used to echo across the block every morning were rarely heard now. They stopped yelling at the mailman, stopped nitpicking about trash bins being an inch out of place, and stopped glaring at every passing car. For the first time since they moved in, the street felt peaceful. But the peace came with a price. Their ruined convertible had been towed away, leaving behind a bare driveway that seemed emptier than ever. They had tried filing complaints, even hinted at lawsuits, but nothing stuck. The police report was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the neighbors' testimonies had sealed their fate. They had trespassed, vandalized, and caused their own destruction. The law wasn't on their side. Financially, the aftermath had hit them hard. Paying for the tree removal, repairing their torn driveway, and covering legal fees had drained them. Rumor had it they even had to sell off a few of their luxury items, furniture, jewelry, and even some designer handbags that neighbors suspected were fake anyway. Watching them carry boxes into pawn shops around town became another chapter. In their slow fall from arrogance, I meanwhile learned something about myself. At first, I thought I would miss the oak too much, that its absence would leave my yard bare and depressing. But instead, I found comfort in the stump. It wasn't just a reminder of loss, it was a reminder of resilience. That tree had stood tall for decades, and in its final act, it had taken down the very people who hated it most. Every time I glanced at it, I couldn't help but smile a little. The neighborhood embraced the story as if it were folklore. People retold it at barbecue, block parties, and casual conversations. Some even gave it nicknames. The fall of the convertible, the oak's revenge, and my personal favorite, karma in the driveway. The tale spread far enough that strangers passing through would occasionally stop and ask, "Is this where the tree crushed the car?" I never thought my quiet street would become known for something like that, but in a strange way it brought people together. There was one evening in particular that stuck with me. A few neighbors gathered on my porch, sharing drinks and laughter. As the sun dipped low, someone asked, "Do you ever wish the tree had fallen somewhere else, maybe spared the car?" I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice steady. "That tree gave them exactly what they deserved. I couldn't have planned it better if I tried." The group nodded in agreement. Everyone knew the sisters had gone too far. Everyone had a story of being on the receiving end of their arrogance, and everyone took a certain satisfaction in knowing they'd finally been humbled, if not by choice, then by fate. As time went on, I planted new things in the yard. A small garden started near the stump, bright flowers in red, yellow, and purple filling the space with color. It wasn't the towering presence of the oak, but it was mine, and it was growing. Life moved forward, and the empty space where the branches once stretched no longer felt sad. It felt open, free, and promising. One day, as I watered the garden, I noticed Patty standing on her porch. She looked thinner, her hair less styled, her expression less sharp. For a moment, our eyes met. She didn't glare this time. She didn't speak. She just looked at me, then at the stump, and finally turned back inside without a word. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get, and I decided it was enough. In the end, the Karens got their wish. The oak was gone, but they lost far more than they gained. They lost their car, their money, and most importantly, their control over the neighborhood. They became a cautionary tale, proof that entitlement has a way of backfiring spectacularly. As for me, I gained something, that I gained the respect of my neighbors, the peace of knowing justice had been served, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing arrogance crushed literally by nature itself. The oak may no longer stand, but its story will stand forever, and in its final fall, it gave me something far more valuable than shade. It gave me closure.